Next up, Mark is going to talk about a few terrestrial invasive plants to look out for this year.
Great, thanks, Ann. It's a pleasure to be here, bat and clean up, so that's always good. I think the first species we'd like to really bring to your attention is one that several years ago we really weren't aware of even existed in Wisconsin. It's called lesser celandine or fig buttercup. It's in the ranunculus genus. And this is a really unique species that it's a perennial ground cover, and where we typically see it are in some of these wetland or low-growing areas and forests or riparian areas, sometimes even disturbed lawns. And it's once the snow melts away and the ground's not frozen, this is when this species starts to pop up, and it blooms in late March to early April. And it's actually fairly easy to identify because there's not much else blooming in late March, early April. But also it has these really unique bulbets or tubers that are underground. If you pull a plant up, you can easily see those below ground, and it really creates a really good mat. So we've recently seen it in southeastern Wisconsin, as you can see in the map. We're starting to see more and more populations of it. So we'd like you, as you're walking around this spring, if you see something that looks like that, please try and report that through the app or one of any other sources, or just even letting us know. This is one that's really, we think we have a lot more of it than we originally thought. And we know it's fairly widespread. There's some big patches of it in Illinois as well. So that's species one I'd like to point out. The other one is another unique species that many of you might have planted at some time, garden or common valerian. This is a perennial plant that can stay relatively small, or in some cases get up to 5 feet tall. And this is a really common plant up in the northern part of Wisconsin, but appears to be invading to the south. And we're starting to pick up some populations in Dane County, and in Manitowoc and Sheboygan we saw some populations this year. So this is definitely one that's spreading, and we want to keep a lookout for. In the northern part of Wisconsin, we can get these really large monotypic stands. In the southern part of the state, we've just seen a few plants here and there, and so we're a little concerned that this plant might really be on the early part of that curve that Ann showed you. This plant blooms in anywhere from June to August. Really, I think late June to early July is where most of the blooming can occur. When it does bloom, it has a very strong, almost sickishly sweet scent that you can see. And if you happen to see some of the seeds, they have these really distinct hairs on them that are really quite beautiful, actually, if you get a chance to see them. But look at them and don't take them with you when you go off to that site, too, because obviously you'll be spreading that plant. It is a restricted species in Wisconsin, and it's got very unique opposite leaves that are pinnately compound. They get smaller as you go up the stem. We recently created a YouTube video to ID this, so you can find that on the Wifton website, and it kind of goes through some of these details. But we're particularly interested how far south this plant is going to spread. We know it's a problem up north, and it's one of our few species spreading from north to south. This third species is no stranger to you, at least I hope so, wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. This is a species that's non-native. Some people will call it invasive. I just call it very weedy for various reasons. It's been in the state for a very long time. But we like to bring this up because several of the other species you might get confused with Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot too. So just a little refresher of what to look for in identifying this, and then we'll contrast this with some of these other species coming up. First off, it blooms later in July to August, so we wouldn't see anything blooming early in the season. It has one single purple flower in the center of the umbel. It's often purple, not always. I think, and I always tell people, the best characteristic is to pull the plant up and smell the root. If it smells like carrot, then it's wild carrot. It's actually unique that our cultivated carrots are the same species as this. They've just been selected for their unique different traits, so they look quite different than this wild carrot. So that carrot smell is really a great identification characteristic. Other characteristics can include this nested nest shape that you see in the lower right-hand corner, which is really common but doesn't happen until much later in the season too. The foliage can be highly variable, and so we'll kind of contrast it with all the other species, but sometimes that can be difficult in identification. So why I wanted to point this one out is that it can be difficult to differentiate wild carrot from this other species, which is a new invader, Scarlet Pimpernel. This is one that is probably heavily underreported because it looks so similar to wild carrot. We are seeing it, and we do have heard reports of it growing side by side with wild carrot in some of these populations to make it even more confusing to identify, and it flowers at approximately the same time frame. It has these white flowers and umbels, just like wild carrot as well, which can make it a challenge. But some of the differences are first in the leaves. The lower leaves are much less divided and more lobed, similar to wild parsnip. In many of the rosettes, people often confuse with wild parsnip. But as those leaves get younger, they become much more divided and smaller in appearance, as you see, is that mid-leaf stem. So that's a real good differentiation. Where that wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace will be even more divided, all of the leaves will be. The other key identifying characteristic is the bract, and that's the leaf at the base of where the inflorescence is. And with wild carrot, I will go back one slide. You can see it often has numerous bracts that we see underneath there in the upper right-hand corner. While we look at Scarlet Pimpernel, it often has no bracts. On very rare occasions, we can see one very small bract too. So we're really anxious for you to look for this species, and if you do find it present, to report it, because we feel it's very heavily underreported in the state. We really don't have a good idea on its distribution. It appears to like disturbed areas and particularly very rocky or sandy soils that drain pretty well too. So those would be good places to look for it. We think a lot of it may well be in the driftless area and just underreported. Moving on in the carrot family now, we're going to talk about Japanese hedge parsley. This is another species. We have a really good video on this species. This is a very large problem and an actively spreading plant in the southern part of Wisconsin, but we have heard some pretty significant populations as we move farther north. It's a biennial, so it'll be a rosette in the first year and flower in the second. And it, again, is going to flower in that same time frame of July to August as wild carrot. I think it's really easy to differentiate from wild carrot, though, because it's not nearly as robust of a plant. It has a very wimpy or open structure and is not nearly as robust of a plant. It also has a very distinct grooved stem with noticeable joints, and the foliage, the stem, and even the fruits all tend to be fairly bristly. They actually have some very significant barbs on the stem which allow them to spread. I've noticed it in Dane County and Madison. It's everywhere in the urban environment, and I think squirrels and other furry creatures are spreading it around. You'll see one or two plants popping up in people's yards that are clearly been distributed by animals too. So that's a real good source of dispersal. Again, we've got a great video that highlights this species, and there's some great images that can really identify it. It seems to be on the spread and continuing to move, and so we ask that you report this if you see this species as well. And last but not least, I want to just remind you about wild chervil. This is another plant in the carrot family that we've been asking you to be on the lookout for. We've since found some fairly large populations in the western part of the state near Chippewa Falls on large roadsides. It's a perennial that kind of acts like a biennial some years. Some years it's more of a perennial that can get anywhere from 1 to 5 feet in height. It's usually in that 2 to 3 foot time frame. Has similar white flat umbels that can be hard to distinguish from wild carrot or even Japanese hedge parsley. But the real big difference is that it flowers early in the season. So late May, early June, if you're driving on the roadside and you see something that's white and flowering in full sun, I would bet you a beer that it's going to be wild carrot. So if you see one of those, we think there's a good chance you'll be seeing that. It's actively spreading on our roadsides through our mowing programs. So we ask that you identify that, and we have a really good video that highlights how to tell the difference between wild carrot and wild chervil, and even some of our other more common carrot species that are invading Wisconsin.